She was 8 months pregnant, standing in the rain outside a shelter with $40 and a garbage bag of clothes. And the man who did this to her was already on television, shaking hands with the mayor. That was Isabella Monteluc, discarded, erased, left to disappear. But her grandfather had other plans, and the empire Marco Valenti spent years trying to steal, it was never his to take. Stay with this story until the very end. Every part will leave you breathless. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Isabella's story travels. The rain came in sideways off the lake, the kind that didn't fall so much as a tack, and Isabella Monteluc stood outside the entrance of the Halcyon Women's Shelter on Dressler Avenue with a black garbage bag in her left hand and $43 folded inside her coat pocket and nothing else. Her shoes had soaked through somewhere around the bus stop on Kellner Street. She could feel the water moving between her toes with every step, that cold, intimate sensation that reminded her exactly how far she had fallen in the span of 72 hours. She was 29 years old, she was 7 months pregnant, and the man who had done this to her was probably at dinner right now, one of those downtown restaurants where they light the candles at 5 and pour wine like water, and the host knows your name before you reach the door. She pushed inside. The woman behind the intake desk was named Cora, 50s, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, the kind of face that had absorbed too many difficult stories to register shock anymore. She looked at Isabella's soaked coat, the garbage bag, the way Isabella was holding her stomach with her free hand, not cradling it exactly, just resting a palm there, like she was making sure something was still real. "First time?" Cora asked. "Yes." "You safe right now? Anyone follow you here?" Isabella thought about Marco, about the way he'd stood in the doorway of their bedroom 3 nights ago, with his arms crossed and his voice completely level, like he was canceling a business arrangement rather than ending a relationship. "You don't have anything that belongs to you. The accounts are in my name, the apartment is in my name. Even that coat you're wearing. I bought that." He'd said it without raising his voice, which was somehow worse than if he'd screamed. "No," Isabella said. "No one followed me." Cora handed her a form on a clipboard. "Fill this out. Take your time." Isabella sat down in one of the plastic chairs along the wall. The fluorescent light above her buzzed, a low mechanical complaint. She pulled the cap off the pen Cora had given her and looked at the form. Name, date of birth, emergency contact. She stopped at emergency contact. Her mother was dead. Her father had left before she was old enough to remember his face. She had one living relative she knew of, a grandfather she hadn't spoken to in 4 years, and the last time she'd tried to reach him, she'd let Marco talk her out of it before she even dialed. She wrote none in the emergency contact field and kept going. Her name was Isabella Vera Monteluc. Born in a city she barely remembered to parents she barely remembered, raised by a grandfather who smelled like cedar and motor oil and spoke to her in a low, careful voice about things she was too young to understand, loyalty and patience, and what it meant to carry a name that other people feared. She had left all of that behind at 24 when she followed Marco Valenti to Chicago and told herself it was love. She was not sure, sitting in that plastic chair with her wet shoes and her garbage bag and her unborn daughter pressing against her ribs, what it had actually been. Something that looked like love, maybe. Something she had confused for it. The room smelled like industrial cleaner and someone else's dinner. A woman across the hall was crying quietly, the kind of crying that had been going on a long time. Isabella kept her eyes on the form. She stayed 3 weeks. She learned the rhythms of the place. Breakfast at 7, the line for the single bathroom on the 2nd floor, the particular silence that fell over the common room at night when the children were asleep and the women sat with their own thoughts. She volunteered in the donation room, sorting clothes, folding things that other people had given away. She was good at it, methodical. She could sort a full bin in under an hour and leave every pile straight, and there was something about the repetitive motion that kept her mind quiet in a way that nothing else did. She did not think about Marco if she could help it. When she did think about him, she thought about the early days before she understood what he was, the way he'd picked her out of a room full of people at one of his father's parties, and looked at her like she was the only object of interest in the world. She'd been 23. She hadn't known then that Marco Valenti looked at everything that way, possessively, calculatingly, as if cataloging what it would cost him to acquire it. She'd found out later. She always found out later. The other women in the shelter were careful around her at first. She was younger than most of them, and she didn't volunteer her story the way some did, sitting in the common room and talking it through like confession. Like saying the words out loud made the weight smaller. Isabella kept her story inside her. She wasn't sure she was done with it yet. At night she lay on her cot and talked quietly to her daughter, her hand resting on her stomach, the words barely sounds at all. I'm going to fix this. I don't know how yet, but I'm going to fix it. The man in the tailored suit came on a Tuesday. Isabella was in the donation room, working through a bin of winter coats when Cora appeared in the doorway with an expression Isabella had never seen on her before, something between caution and curiosity. There's someone asking for you, Cora said. Says he knows you. I told him you'd have to come out and verify that yourself. Did he give a name? Rinaldi. Salvatore Rinaldi. Isabella set down the coat she was holding. She knew that name. She had not heard it in 4 years, and she had spent most of those 4 years trying not to think about the world it belonged to. But she knew it the way you know the sound of a particular door in the house you grew up in, instinctively, before you even process the recognition. Salvatore Rinaldi had been her grandfather's closest advisor for as long as Isabella could remember. A quiet man, precise, the kind of person who said exactly as much as was necessary and never a word more, and who had watched her with those careful dark eyes at family gatherings when she was a child, like he was already reading something in her that she hadn't written yet. She walked out to the front reception area. He was standing near the door, hat in hand, wearing a dark charcoal suit that was too good for the neighborhood and too restrained to be ostentatious. He was in his late 60s now, silver-haired, and he hadn't changed as much as she'd expected. His posture was exactly as she remembered, straight, contained, like a man who had learned long ago to make no unnecessary movement. He looked at her. The coat, the slightly swollen hands, the way she was carrying the weight of the pregnancy forward, and his expression didn't change, but something moved behind his eyes. Isabella, he said. Salvatore. She crossed her arms over her chest. How did you find me? It took some time. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. It's not. He glanced toward the chairs along the wall. Could we sit? You can say whatever you came to say standing up. He accepted that without argument. He reached inside his jacket and produced a sealed envelope, cream-colored, heavy paper, and held it out to her. She didn't take it immediately. She looked at it the way you look at something you're not sure you want to open. Your grandfather is gone, Rinaldi said. Aurelio passed 11 days ago. The words landed differently than she expected. She had not spoken to her grandfather in 4 years. She had told herself, in the way you tell yourself things when the guilt gets too specific, that he was old, that the silence had gone on too long to break cleanly, that she would do it later when things settled. She had not done it later, and now it was the kind of later that closed permanently. I didn't know, she said. We couldn't locate you immediately. She took the envelope. It was heavier than it looked. She didn't open it. What does it say? It says everything, Rinaldi said. The compound on Hartwell Road, the Del Vanto portfolio, the Vesper accounts, the Castellino businesses. He paused. And the organization. Isabella looked up from the envelope. He left it to me, she said. It wasn't a question. She knew her grandfather. She had always known, in the part of herself she'd tried to suppress, that this was always the direction it was pointed. Every piece of it, Rinaldi said, with conditions. Of course with conditions. He didn't believe in gifts without weight behind them. No, Isabella said quietly. He never did. She looked at the envelope again. $43 in her pocket. A garbage bag of clothes upstairs. A daughter she was going to bring into the world in 9 weeks, and no address to put on the birth certificate that wouldn't make her ashamed. Tell me the conditions, she said. Boss. She left the shelter the next morning. Cora walked her to the door, and there was a moment where the two women stood in the entryway, and Cora looked at her with that particular expression she reserved for the ones she wasn't sure about. Not worried exactly, but watchful. You sure about this? Cora asked. No, Isabella said. Good answer, Cora said, and she held the door. Rinaldi was waiting at the curb in a black car that was clean and unremarkable, the kind of car that was chosen specifically to not attract attention. He opened the rear door for her without being asked. She got in, and the car pulled away from Dressler Avenue, and Isabella did not look back at the shelter as they drove. She wasn't sure what she was feeling. Not relief. Something more complicated than relief. Something that had fear inside it, and something that might have been anger, and somewhere underneath that a cold, hard thread of something she was not quite ready to call purpose. Rinaldi sat in the front passenger seat and said nothing for the first 20 minutes. She had forgotten that about him, the way he understood that silence was sometimes the most useful thing a person could offer. The families, she said eventually. Aurelio's brief said 5. 5 families, Rinaldi confirmed. The Del Vanto, the Castellino, the Ferraro, the Acqua, and the Moretti branch. Each one controls a different element of the organization. Together, they made your grandfather's empire function. Divided, which is what they are now, they are vulnerable to exactly the kind of pressure Marco Valenti has been applying for the last 3 years. Isabella absorbed that. He's been doing it deliberately, she said, splitting them. Systematically, Rinaldi said. He created disputes, fed misinformation, arranged situations that put the families in conflict with each other. He's been positioning himself as the solution to problems he manufactured. By the time your grandfather died, 3 of the 5 families were barely speaking to each other. And they'll accept me as Aurelio's heir. Rinaldi was quiet for a moment. They'll have to be convinced. That's also not an answer. He turned in his seat to look at her. Dante Monteluce doesn't believe you're capable. He's said as much to anyone who will listen. The Ferraro family has existing financial agreements with Marco that will be difficult to disentangle, and the Moretti branch hasn't trusted a Monteluce in leadership since a conflict with your grandfather 9 years ago that was never fully resolved. So the conditions in the will aren't just formalities. They're survival requirements, Rinaldi said simply. Aurelio didn't design them to be cruel. He designed them because he knew exactly what you were walking into. Isabella looked out the window at the city moving past. Chicago in November, gray and wind-scrubbed, the lake somewhere out beyond the buildings like a flat steel plate. She had come to the city for Marco. She had built 4 years of her life inside the world he'd constructed, and she had let him erase her piece by piece until there was almost nothing left that she recognized. She pressed her palm against her stomach. The baby shifted. I'm going to fix this. The Monteluce compound on Hartwell Road was a 3-story Victorian on a gated lot with mature oak trees along the perimeter and a detached garage that held 6 vehicles under canvas covers. Isabella had not been here since she was 22. She remembered it larger somehow, though now looking at it from the car window, it seemed exactly the same size. Significant, measured, a house that made no unnecessary statements. There were 3 people waiting at the front entrance when the car came through the gate. The woman was Elena Sara, Aurelio's household manager, 60-something, compact, with a face that seemed to run on pure efficiency. Beside her was a young man in his late 20s, dark-haired, with his arms crossed, and an expression so openly skeptical it was almost refreshing in its lack of pretense. Isabella recognized the third person immediately. Dante Monteluce was 41, broad-shouldered, and had been her grandfather's cousin's eldest son, which made him her cousin by a path sufficiently removed that they had never been close, though not so removed that the blood connection was meaningless. He was looking at her the way you look at a piece of furniture someone has placed in the wrong room. She got out of the car before Rinaldi could open the door for her. Dante spoke before she reached the steps. You look worse than I expected. Hello, Dante. You've been living in a shelter. Yes. And before that, you were with Marco Valenti for 4 years. Also, yes. He uncrossed his arms. We don't need to pretend this is comfortable. Aurelio left you the legacy because he was an old man with sentimental ideas about bloodlines and redemption. That's his right. But this organization doesn't run on sentiment, and if you think walking in here with his name and his will is going to be enough to hold these families together, you're going to get people killed." The words were blunt. Isabella had expected something like them. She had not expected to feel the accuracy of them so physically, like a thumb pressed against a bruise. "I know," she said. Dante blinked. He'd expected pushback. "I know what I don't know," she continued. "I know what Marco did to the families, and I know the position I'm walking into, and I know that you have every reason to doubt me. What you don't know is that I've been watching Marco Valenti operate for 4 years from directly inside his organization, and I understand exactly how he thinks, where his leverage comes from, and what it costs him to sustain it." She held Dante's gaze. "You might not believe I can lead, but I'm the only person in this city who can beat him." Silence. The wind moved through the oak trees. Dante looked at her for a long moment with those flat, evaluating eyes. "We'll see," he said, and he went back inside. Elena Sara stepped forward and took Isabella's bag with quiet efficiency. "I've prepared the East Suite," she said. "The compound staff are assembled if you'd like to meet them today, though Mr. Rinaldi mentioned you may want rest first." "I'll meet them today," Isabella said. She followed Elena up the steps and through the front door, and for a moment the smell of the interior hit her. Cedar and old wood and something faintly mechanical that had been embedded in the walls for decades. And she stopped moving. It was exactly how she remembered it. She had not let herself think about this place for 4 years. She had told herself she was done with it, that she'd chosen a different life, that the world her grandfather occupied was one she could walk away from cleanly. She understood now, standing in the entrance hall of the compound with his absence filling every room, that she had not been walking away from it. She had only been delaying the return. She was home. Alco. It was on her 3rd night at the compound that Rinaldi showed her the legal files. They sat across from each other at the large table in the study, which still held Aurelio's books on 2 walls and the faint smell of the man himself, and Rinaldi opened a folder and placed a set of documents in front of her without comment. Isabella read them. Then she read them again. The 3rd page was a court filing. Marco Valenti, acting through his attorneys, had initiated custody proceedings claiming Isabella Monteluce was psychologically unstable, financially unfit, and constitutionally incapable of providing a stable environment for a child. He was seeking preemptive legal intervention prior to the child's birth. He was trying to take her daughter before she was even born. Isabella set the page down on the table very carefully. She was aware of her own hands, how steady they were. She found that strange. Her chest felt like something was being slowly compressed inside it, but her hands were completely still. "When was this filed?" she asked. 8 days ago, Rinaldi said, "before Aurelio died." Yes, Marco would have known, through whatever contacts he has in the family, that the will was coming. This was preemptive. He wants you responding to legal crisis rather than focusing on the transition. He knows I can't fight him legally without resources. He's counting on it. Isabella looked at the documents. 8 months ago, she had believed that Marco Valenti was the kind of man who operated at the edge of legal limits, but understood where those limits were. That was before she understood that the limits themselves were something he used as a tool, something he bent and redirected and made work for him in ways that looked legitimate from a distance. She had underestimated him. She had spent 4 years underestimating him because some part of her had needed to, because the alternative was understanding that she had given 4 years of her life to someone who had never once seen her as a person. "He's going to come after the compound next," she said. "If the families are divided, the legal structure protecting the assets is weakened. He has somebody on the inside, huh? He has to. Someone who's been feeding him information about Aurelio's condition, the will, the family disputes." Rinaldi said nothing, which was itself a kind of answer. "Who?" Isabella said. "I have a suspicion," Rinaldi said carefully. "But a suspicion isn't confirmation, and if I move on it incorrectly, it will fracture the Ferraro alliance before you've had a chance to build it. Tell me anyway." He looked at her. Some calculation behind his eyes, something he was deciding about her. "Luca Ferraro, son," he said. "The younger son. He's been passing information, We believed Marco directly. We have enough circumstantial evidence to present to the Ferraro family, but the family patriarch, Angelo Ferraro, has a 40-year relationship with Aurelio's memory, and he will not accept an accusation against his son without airtight proof. Then we get airtight proof. And if we push for it before you've established credibility with the other families, then we do both at the same time, Isabella said. Rinaldi looked at her for a moment. Aurelio said you would say something like that, he said. There was something in his voice she couldn't fully identify, Chas. Not quite pride, not quite grief. Something between them. Isabella picked up the custody filing again. She read Marco's name on the document, his attorney's name, the neat legal language wrapping something vicious in procedural politeness, psychologically unstable. She thought about the shelter on Dressler Avenue, about folding other people's donated clothes in a fluorescent-lit room and talking to her unborn daughter in the dark. She thought about standing in that entrance hall 3 nights ago and understanding that she had never actually left this place, that some part of her had always been standing here, waiting for herself to arrive. She set the document down. Set up a meeting with the Delvanto family first, she said. They were closest to Aurelio and least compromised by Marco's interference. I want to start where the ground is solid. And the Ferraro situation? We move on it in parallel, quietly. She looked at Rinaldi. And I want everything Marco has filed, every legal document, every motion. I want to understand exactly what he's built so I know what I'm dismantling. Rinaldi nodded. He began gathering the documents. One more thing, Isabella said. He paused. The organization, she said. The parts that aren't the legitimate businesses. I need to know exactly what they are and how they operate. Rinaldi was still for a moment. Aurelio kept certain details from you. He thought, I know what he thought, Isabella said. He thought he was protecting me. Her voice was even. I don't need protection. I need information, all of it. A long pause. The study was very quiet. I'll arrange a full briefing, Rinaldi said. She nodded. He left. Isabella sat alone at her grandfather's table in her grandfather's study, the documents spread in front of her, the compound settling into its night sounds around her. Outside, the oak trees moved in the wind off the lake. Somewhere in the city, Marco Valenti was already making his next move. She thought about what Dante had said on the front steps. You're going to get people killed. He wasn't wrong to be afraid of that. The possibility was real, and the weight of it was something she was going to have to carry every day she sat in this chair. But the alternative was to let Marco finish what he'd started. Not just with her, not just with the compound, but with every person in this organization who had trusted Aurelio and now had nowhere else to stand. She placed her hand on the surface of the table. The wood was cool, solid, old. She was still sitting there when her phone buzzed on the table. She looked at the screen. The message was from a number she didn't recognize, 3 words only, and the chill that moved through her when she read them had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. She's not safe. Isabella stared at the screen. Her daughter shifted inside her, a slow roll of movement against her ribs, and Isabella's hand was on her stomach before the thought was even complete. She was still staring at the message when Rinaldi's footsteps came back down the hallway, faster than they should have been, and he opened the study door with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Something had happened. Rinaldi stood in the doorway of the study with his coat still on, which meant he hadn't taken it off since he'd left the room 10 minutes ago, which meant whatever had happened fast. Talk, Isabella said. Luca Ferraro is gone. He came inside and closed the door behind him. His apartment on Crestline has been cleared out. Personal effects, cash, a go bag he apparently kept ready. Building Super says he left sometime this evening. Isabella looked at her phone. The message was still on the screen. She's not safe. He sent this, she said. She turned the phone so Rinaldi could see it. Rinaldi looked at the screen. Something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly, but the particular expression of a man whose suspicion has been confirmed at the worst possible moment. He panicked, Rinaldi said. Or he warned me, Isabella said. Before he ran. Both things can be true. She set the phone face down on the table. Her mind was moving fast, pulling at the threads. Luca Ferraro had been feeding Marco information. That was the working assumption. But if Luca was also the one sending anonymous warnings, that meant his relationship with Marco was not the clean transactional loyalty it appeared to be. It meant Luca had been operating under some kind of pressure. Fear, debt, coercion. Something that had made him cooperate, and something that had finally made him run. If Marco knows Luca ran, he knows we're going to move on the Ferraro family, Isabella said. He'll get to Angelo Ferraro first. It's possible he already has. Then we go tonight. Rinaldi's expression changed. Isabella, tonight, she said. She was already standing. If we wait until morning and Marco has spent 12 hours working on Angelo Ferraro, we lose the Ferraro alliance before it begins. Angelo Ferraro is 68 years old, and he's been in this world his entire life, and the one thing men like him cannot tolerate is being lied to by their own family. If I walk in there tonight before Marco can shape the story, and I tell Angelo the truth about what his son was doing, I give him the choice of how to respond to it. If Marco gets there first and frames it as an attack on the Ferraro name, we lose him permanently. Rinaldi was quiet for 3 full seconds. In another man, that might have meant hesitation. In Rinaldi, it meant calculation. The Ferraro house is in Glenmore, he said. 40 minutes. Then we should leave now, Sat. The Ferraro house was a low, wide property set back from the road behind a wrought iron fence, the kind of home that communicated wealth through restraint rather than display. Every light in the front of the house was on, which at 11 at night meant either Angelo Ferraro didn't sleep or someone had already called him. Rinaldi spoke into the intercom at the gate. There was a pause, long enough that Isabella thought they might be turned away, and then the gate opened. Angelo Ferraro met them in the front room, not the formal sitting room, the actual front room, with its worn leather chairs and the side table with the reading lamp and the remnants of a glass of something amber that had been set down in a hurry. He was a large man, thick through the chest, with white hair cut close, and the particular quality of stillness that belonged to people who had learned to be very dangerous without looking like it. He looked at Isabella the way people look at someone they're trying to place. Aurelio's granddaughter, he said. Yes. I knew your grandfather for 40 years. He didn't say it warmly. He said it the way you establish a fact before a difficult conversation. Sit down. They sat. Angelo did not sit. He stood near the window with his hands in his pockets and looked at Isabella with eyes that were doing a great deal of work. My son called me 2 hours ago, Angelo said. He told me he'd made mistakes. He didn't tell me what kind. His jaw tightened. Then he stopped answering his phone. Luca has been providing information to Marco Valenti, Isabella said. She kept her voice level. Over approximately 18 months. We believe he was passing details about your family's financial arrangements, your communications with Aurelio, and the internal disputes between the 5 families that Marco has been deliberately escalating. The room was very quiet. Angelo's face did not break, but something behind it did. Something small and carefully maintained, like a wall that had been mortared too many times already. Finally taking one crack too many. You have evidence of this, he said. Circumstantial. Rinaldi can walk you through it. It's enough to support the conclusion, but not enough to stand alone in a legal proceeding. I'm not asking about a legal proceeding. No, Isabella said. I know you're not. Angelo turned away from her. He walked to the window and stood with his back to them and looked out at his front lawn in the dark. His mother died when he was 19, Angelo said, to no one in particular, to the window. He was never the same after that. I told myself it was grief. I told myself it would pass. He stopped. I made accommodations I shouldn't have. I missed things I should have seen. Isabella said nothing. This was not a moment that needed anything from her. What do you need from me? Angelo said. He turned back from the window. His face had settled into something hard and resolved. In terms of the alliance. A meeting with the other families, Isabella said. You and Rinaldi arrange it. Your involvement signals that the Ferraro family is aligned with the Monteluce transition. It cuts Marco's leverage significantly. And my son. That's your decision, Isabella said. I'm not here to tell you how to handle your family. Angelo looked at her. Something passed across his face that might, in a different context, have been respect. Your grandfather would have said exactly that, he said. He understood where lines were. He taught me, Isabella said. The drive back to the compound took 40 minutes. Isabella sat in the rear of the car and stared at the city through the window and tried to organize what she knew. Marco had an inside source who was now gone. That meant he'd be moving faster now, before the evidence of his infiltration could be consolidated and used against him. He had the legal filing already in motion. The custody petition, the psychological instability claim, the machinery of legitimate process being used to do something that was not legitimate at all. He had, almost certainly, financial instruments designed to complicate the transfer of the Montelus assets, and he had, somewhere in the organization, other relationships she hadn't found yet. Luca Ferraro had been one thread. He wouldn't have been the only one. She closed her eyes. The baby moved. She breathed through it and let herself be tired for exactly the length of the drive, and then, when the car turned through the compound gate, she sat up straight. Dante was waiting in the entrance hall. He was still dressed, though it was past midnight, which told her he'd been monitoring the evening's developments through channels she hadn't authorized. She filed that away. You went to Ferraro's house, he said. Yes. Without consulting the family council. There's no family council yet, Isabella said. There's you, and there's Rinaldi, and there's me. I made a decision. Dante's expression was controlled, but the tension in it was doing work underneath the surface. You're 8 months pregnant, and you went to a meeting at 11 at night with a family that has a compromised member and a direct connection to Marco Valenti, without backup, without informing anyone. Rinaldi was with me. Rinaldi is 67 years old. He's also the most effective person in this building. Isabella began moving toward the stairs. We got the Ferraro alignment. Angelo will reach out to the Delvanto and Castellino families in the morning. We have the framework for the coalition meeting. Dante moved to put himself in her path. Not aggressively, just deliberately enough that she had to stop. I need you to understand something, he said. His voice had lost the edge. What replaced it was something more uncomfortable. Honesty. This isn't about whether I think you're capable. This is about what happens to 40 families and 300 people and everything your grandfather spent his life building if you make a mistake that gets you killed in the next 8 weeks. Isabella looked at him. He was standing close enough that she could see the actual exhaustion on his face, the lines around his eyes, the way his jaw was holding tension. It had probably been holding for weeks. I know, she said, and I know you've been managing this alone since Aurelio got sick. His expression shifted, slightly, but she saw it. I'm not trying to replace what you've been doing, she continued. I'm trying to make it possible for both of us to still be standing when this is over. But I cannot operate by committee when the situation changes every 6 hours. I need you to trust that I am not making decisions carelessly. I don't trust people on principle, Dante said. I trust them based on evidence. Fair, Isabella said. Then I'll give you evidence. She moved past him and went up the stairs. She slept 4 hours. She was awake at 5:30 when the call came in. The voice on the other end was a woman she didn't know, speaking quickly. A low, urgent murmur like someone talking in a space where they didn't want to be overheard. My name is Cara Voss, the woman said. I worked for Marco Valenti. Accounts management, 3 years. I'm calling because I've been trying to find a way out for 6 months, and I think you might be the only person who can create one. Isabella sat up. The room was gray with early light. How did you get this number? Luca Ferraro. He gave it to me before he disappeared. A pause. He said, if anything happened to him, I should contact you directly. He said you'd listen. I'm listening, Isabella said. I have documentation, Cara Voss said. Financial records, internal communications, wire transfer logs going back 20 months. Marco has been systematically moving money through shell companies, laundering it through a construction subsidiary and 3 import businesses. The amounts are significant, enough for federal interest if it goes to the right people. Isabella's hand tightened on the phone. Why are you coming forward now? The woman was quiet for a moment. Because last week he asked me to falsify records for the custody filing against you. He wanted documentation of financial instability that I would have had to fabricate, and She stopped. I have kids. I know what he's trying to do to you, and I know it's wrong, and I know that if I stay quiet and just keep doing my job, there's no version of this that ends well for me anyway. Are you safe right now? For the moment. Don't go back to the office. Don't contact Marco or anyone on his staff. Isabella was already moving, pulling on clothes with one hand, the phone wedged between her ear and her shoulder. I'm going to give you a number. You call it and tell them Isabella sent you. Do not use your regular phone after this call. She gave Capos Rinaldi's emergency contact. Then she hung up and stood in the gray room for a moment with her hand on the wall, breathing. This was the opening. This was the crack in Marco's foundation that everything else could be leveraged through. But it was also a trap if she moved wrong. If Marco knew Kara had made contact, if he'd set this up deliberately to draw Isabella into exposing her legal strategy before she had enough evidence secured. She couldn't know yet. She had to move and stay suspicious simultaneously. She finished dressing and went downstairs. The coalition meeting happened 3 days later. Rinaldi secured a location, a private room at the back of a restaurant in the Millbrook neighborhood, owned by a man who had done business with Aurelio for 20 years and could be trusted to keep his mouth shut. 4 of the 5 families sent representatives. The Moretti branch, as predicted, sent a message rather than a person. We're watching. We'll make a decision when there's something to decide about. That was fine. Isabella had not expected them yet. She sat at the head of the table. Dante sat to her right. Rinaldi sat to her left, and his presence there, visible, deliberate, the signal it sent that Aurelio's closest advisor was standing behind her, was worth more than anything she could have said in opening remarks. She looked around the table. Angelo Ferraro, sitting with his hands folded, his face giving nothing away. 2 representatives from the Delvanto family, older men who had known her grandfather and were watching her with a combination of grief and assessment. A woman named Petra Castellino, 50s, sharp-eyed, who ran the Castellino operation since her husband had a stroke 2 years ago and had been running it significantly better than her husband had. I'm not going to tell you I've earned your trust, Isabella said. I haven't. I'm 4 days into this compound, and I've spent the last 4 years outside this world. What I can tell you is what I know. She laid the Luca Ferraro documentation on the table, Rinaldi's compilation, the financial cross-references, the communication records. Marco Valenti has been using a compromised member of the Ferraro family to monitor your communications and your internal disputes. He manufactured the conflict between the Delvanto and the Castellino over the Harwick port operations. That conflict was not organic. It was engineered. The 2 Delvanto men looked at each other. Petra Castellino's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He has been planning to step into the vacuum created by Aurelio's death, Isabella continued. He has been planning it for 3 years. He knows every pressure point in this organization because he's been building his knowledge systematically. What he does not know, what he has not planned for, is this meeting. What does this meeting accomplish? One of the Delvanto men asked. His name was Gavino, and he was the skeptic at the table. We're 4 families, 3.5, agreeing to sit in a room together. Marco Valenti still has resources we don't have. He still has legitimate legal infrastructure, political contacts, and the advantage of being positioned as an outside party with clean hands. I have a source inside his financial operation, Isabella said. Silence. Documented evidence of money laundering through his construction subsidiary and 3 import businesses, wire transfers, internal communications, 20 months of records. She let that land. I'm not going to use it through the organization. I'm going to take it to the Federal Financial Crimes Unit. I'm going to let the legal system do what it does, and while it's doing it, we stop competing with Marco in the spaces where he's artificially strongest, and we consolidate in the spaces where this organization is actually strongest. Petra Castellino spoke for the first time. Her voice was precise and dry. You're proposing we let the federal government into our business. I'm proposing we use the federal government to remove a threat, Isabella said. There's a difference. The documentation I have concerns Marco's operation specifically. It doesn't expose anyone in this room. She paused. If anyone in this room has operations, They'd prefer the federal government not examine. That's a separate conversation, and I'll have it with them individually. Right now, I'm talking about eliminating Marco Valenti's ability to come after what Aurelio built. Another silence. Different in quality from the first one. Something was shifting. Gavino del Vanto looked at Rinaldi. You vouch for this? I vouch for the documentation, Rinaldi said, and I vouch for the judgment behind it. Gavino looked back at Isabella. He breathed out through his nose. What do you need from us? Two things happened in the 48 hours after the coalition meeting. The first was that Marco Valenti's attorneys filed an emergency supplementary motion in the custody case, claiming that Isabella had made threatening contact with business associates of Mr. Valenti and requesting immediate court intervention. The motion was thin and rushed, which meant Marco was reacting. Reacting meant he'd found out about the meeting faster than Isabella had expected, which confirmed there was a second source inside the coalition families beyond Luca Ferraro. The second thing was that Cara Voss went missing. Rinaldi told her on a Thursday morning, standing in the doorway of the study with that same fast-walk energy that meant no good news. Cara Voss had checked into a motel in Skokie under a false name, a motel Rinaldi's contacts had identified. And when the contact arrived at the room on Thursday morning to transfer her to a safer location, the room was empty. No sign of struggle. No note. Her phone was on the table, battery removed. Isabella stood at the window of the study and looked at the oak trees. He has her, she said. We don't know that. He has her, she said again, and he knows she talked to me, which means he knows I have at least partial documentation of his financial operations. She turned from the window. He's going to move the money. He'll liquidate whatever he can reach and shift it before the documentation becomes actionable. We have maybe 72 hours before the records I have become worthless. The federal contact Rinaldi has been developing needs 2 more weeks to... We don't have 2 more weeks. Dante was in the corner of the room. He had started attending these morning conversations without being asked, which Isabella had decided to accept as a form of progress. He spoke without looking up from the floor. If we move the evidence to federal investigators now, without the full package, they'll open a preliminary inquiry and Marco will know it immediately through his legal contacts. He'll claim persecution, political targeting. He has enough legitimate business on record to muddy the picture significantly. We'd be handing him a narrative. I know, Isabella said. So what do you want to do? Isabella looked at them both. The 2 men in the room who represented, between them, everything she had and everyone she could rely on in a situation that had just gotten significantly worse. Find Cara Voss, she said. That's the immediate priority. If she's alive and he's holding her somewhere, getting her out is the only thing that matters in the next 12 hours. She looked at Dante. You said you don't trust on principle. You said you trust based on evidence. I need you to start making calls to people I don't have access to yet. People who owe this family and who have operational capability. Can you do that? Dante looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said. Then do it. He left the room. Rinaldi was watching her. And if Cara Voss is not recoverable? Isabella understood what he was asking, if Marco had already ensured her silence. Then we work with what we have, Isabella said. And we move faster than we planned. She pressed her palm flat against the surface of the table, the old wood solid under her hand. He escalated because he's afraid. People who aren't afraid don't make emergency court filings at 4 a.m. He's afraid because this coalition meeting was the first time in 3 years that the families sat in the same room and didn't fight. That matters to him. It means he's losing the thing he spent 3 years building, and he can feel it. That also makes him more dangerous, Rinaldi said. I know. She looked at him. He's going to do something large, something designed to shock everyone back into the positions he needs them in. She could feel the shape of it, the logic of Marco's thinking, the particular way he calculated where pressure produced the most result. She had watched him make decisions for 4 years. She understood the architecture of how he thought even when she hadn't understood the full scope of what he was doing. He's going to come after the compound. Rinaldi was very still. You believe he'd make a direct move? Not direct. He'll make it look like internal conflict, an incident that discredits me, that makes the families believe the Monteluce transition is too unstable to support. She looked at the door. We need to find out who the second source is before he uses them. She was still turning the problem when her phone rang. The number was one she'd never seen before, different from the one that had sent the warning 3 nights ago, and something in her stomach tightened as she picked it up. The voice on the other end was Marco's. She had not heard his voice in 3 months. It landed in her chest with a physical weight, the particular low evenness of it, the absence of anything rushed or disturbed, as if this were a business call between colleagues. Isabella, he said. She said nothing. I want you to listen carefully, Marco said. But so shitty, because I'm only going to say this once, and I'd like you to understand that what I'm about to offer is genuinely the last reasonable option available to you. A pause. Walk away from the compound. Renounce the Monteluce transfer in writing. Take a settlement. I'll make it enough to be comfortable, enough for the child's future. And I will drop the custody proceedings immediately. Isabella breathed in through her nose. You had Capos taken, she said. Capos made a decision that wasn't in her best interest. That's not something I did. That's a consequence of choices. Where is she? She's fine, Marco said. She'll stay fine as long as this conversation goes in a productive direction. Another pause. I don't want to hurt you, Isabella. I want you to understand that this situation doesn't have to end in damage. You walked into something that was never yours to walk into. Your grandfather loved you. I understand that. But love isn't a qualification. Isabella looked at Rinaldi across the table. He was watching her face, reading it. You know what I found interesting? She said. Her voice was steady. She was slightly surprised by how steady it was. You just told me Capos is alive and in your custody. You just told me you've been making emergency legal filings because you're panicking. And you just told me you're willing to offer a settlement, which means you know the evidence exists and you know what it can do to you. She kept her voice even. You didn't call to offer me a way out. You called because you needed to know how much I have and how close I am. A silence on the other end of the line, long enough to be a confirmation. You're making a mistake, Marco said, and his voice had changed. The evenness still there, but something underneath it that was not calm at all. I've made plenty of those, Isabella said. I made them for 4 years. She looked at the surface of the table, her grandfather's table. This isn't one of them. She ended the call. The room was very quiet. Rinaldi was looking at her with an expression she had never quite seen on his face before and could not immediately name. He has Capos, she said. He's going to realize in the next few hours that this call didn't accomplish what he needed it to. When that happens, he's going to move. She stood up from the table. The baby moved, a slow, insistent pressure against her ribs, and she breathed through it. Get Dante back in here. Get Angelo Ferraro on the phone, and find me the address of every property Marco Valenti owns or controls within 40 miles of this city. She was halfway to the door when Rinaldi spoke. Isabella? She stopped. Your grandfather spent 30 years building what you're trying to hold together in 2 weeks, Rinaldi said. Not a rebuke. A fact, offered carefully. I know, she said. He also told me, Rinaldi continued, the year before he died, that he believed you were the only person who could do it faster. She stood in the doorway for a moment with her back to him. Then she walked out into the hallway, and before she reached the stairs, her phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. A set of GPS coordinates and 4 words beneath them that stopped her cold on the 3rd step. She's here. Come now. The coordinates led to a self-storage facility on Kessler Industrial Road, 12 minutes from the compound, in a part of the city that had been industrial once and was now the particular kind of abandon that happens when industry leaves and nothing comes to replace it. Corrugated metal buildings, chain-link fencing with rust at the joints, sodium lights on tall poles that turned everything the color of old teeth. Isabella rode with Dante in the lead car. Rinaldi had wanted to come. She had told him no, that if this was a trap, she needed him at the compound managing the families, not caught in it beside her. He had not argued, which meant he agreed with her assessment and didn't like either option. Dante drove without speaking. He had 2 men from the compound in the back seat, quiet professionals who moved with the practiced stillness of people who had been in dangerous rooms before. Isabella sat in the front passenger seat with her phone in her hand and the GPS coordinates locked on the screen and tried to think clearly about what she was walking into. The message had been 4 words, no name, no context. The number was unregistered. It could be Luca Ferraro making contact again before disappearing for good. It could be someone inside Marco's operation who had decided the exit was now or never. It could be Marco himself, running a more sophisticated version of the conversation they'd already had. She could not know. She was going anyway. "If this goes wrong," Dante said, not looking at her, his eyes on the road, "I need you to stay in the car." "That's not going to happen." "I'm not asking." "I know," Isabella said. "I'm telling you it's not going to happen. If Capos is in there, I need to be the one she sees first. She came to me. If she wakes up to strangers in a dark building, she's going to shut down." Dante's jaw worked. He didn't say anything else. The storage facility gate was open when they arrived. The kind of open that meant someone had cut the padlock, not the kind that meant it had been left unlocked carelessly. Dante pulled the car inside the fence line and cut the headlights. The 2 men from the back seat were already out, moving along the edge of the building in the sodium orange dark. Isabella got out. The air smelled like rust and standing water, and the specific cold of a place that didn't retain heat. Her shoes were quiet on the cracked asphalt. She followed the numbers on the storage unit doors. They were in the 300s on this row, until she found 314, which had its roll door raised about 2 feet off the ground, enough for light to spill out from underneath. She crouched down. It pulled against the weight of her stomach, and she steadied herself with a hand on the door's edge, and she looked inside. Capos was on the floor, her back against the far wall, her wrists zip-tied in front of her. She was conscious. She looked up when Isabella's face appeared at the bottom of the door gap, and something in her expression that had been very tightly controlled suddenly wasn't. "Can you move?" Isabella said quietly. "Yes." Kara's voice was ragged at the edges but steady underneath. "My ankles are free. They only tied my hands." "Is anyone with you in there?" "Not anymore. There were 2 of them. They left about 20 minutes ago." She paused. "I think they were told to leave." Isabella processed that, filed it. She got her fingers under the roll door and pushed it up, the metal rattling in its tracks, loud enough to make her wince, and she went inside. Capos was in her mid-30s, dark-haired, with a bruise developing along her left cheekbone and the kind of focused, controlled quality that people have when they've been through something frightening and have decided that falling apart is not an option yet. She watched Isabella cross the concrete floor toward her with an expression that was equal parts relief and something harder to name. Isabella crouched in front of her and pulled a folding knife from her coat pocket. Rinaldi had pressed it on her at the front door of the compound, and she had taken it without comment and cut the zip ties. Kara brought her wrists up and rubbed them. The skin was abraded, but not badly. "They were told to leave," Isabella said. "By who?" "I don't know. One of them got a call about 30 minutes ago. He said something to the other one. I couldn't hear it clearly. And then they both left." Kara looked at her. It felt like a decision coming from above them. Marco. Or someone managing Marco's operations. He doesn't always make calls directly. Isabella sat back on her heels and looked at Kara. "Why would he tell them to leave you?" Capos looked at her for a moment, and what Isabella saw in her face was not fear exactly. It was the expression of someone who has been carrying a piece of information and has been trying to decide when to set it down. "Because he doesn't need me anymore," Kara said. "He got what he came for." Isabella went still. "What does that mean?" she said. "The documentation I gave you," Kara said. "The financial records. Before they took me, I'm sorry, I didn't know, I didn't realize until I was already here and going through it in my head. The file I transferred to you had a tracker embedded in it, a digital marker. It would have logged where the file was opened, what device, what network." She stopped. "He knows where you are. He knows you're at the compound. He knows what network you're using, which means he knows what systems you have access to." Her voice tightened. "He let me contact you. He wanted me to. The whole thing was a map," Isabella said. The word left her mouth, and then the space around her seemed to go very quiet in a particular way, The kind of quiet that happens when something you've been running on turns out to have been wrong from the beginning. She stood up. Her legs were not entirely steady. She focused on the concrete floor, on the specific sensation of her feet inside her shoes, on the physical fact of the room around her. He had let Cara Voss run. He had let Luca Ferraro give Cara Isabella's number. He had allowed the contact, allowed the documentation transfer, allowed Isabella to believe she was building something, and all of it had been a mechanism for learning exactly where she was operating from, what systems the compound was connected to, and how far along her legal strategy had advanced. She had walked directly into it. "The federal contact," she said. Her voice came out very flat. "Rinaldi's contact in the financial crimes unit. If Marco has the network data from the compound, he can trace the communications." Cara's silence was its own answer. Isabella pulled out her phone and called Rinaldi. He picked up on the first ring. "Lock down the compound network right now," she said. "Everything. Shut off external communications, sever the connection to the legal files, pull the federal contact's information out of any system that's been active in the last 72 hours. Do it now. Don't wait for me to explain." A brief pause. Then, "Already in motion." "What do you mean already?" "We found something 20 minutes ago," Rinaldi said. "A device, in the study, behind the second shelf of books on the east wall." Isabella's mouth went dry. "A listening device," she said. "Small, professional grade. It would have been placed within the last week." He paused. "I'm sorry, Isabella. I swept the room when you arrived. I didn't go behind the shelves." "How long has it been active?" "We can't know precisely. If it went in after your arrival, 3 days at most. If it was placed before—" He stopped. "Before I arrived," she said. "Which means it was placed while the compound was being managed during Aurelio's final weeks." "Yes." She stood in the storage unit on Kessler Industrial Road, with Cara Voss watching her from the floor and Dante's footsteps approaching from outside. And she thought about every conversation she had held in that study. The documentation discussion, the Ferraro strategy, the coalition meeting logistics, the federal contact's name spoken aloud across that table. Every word. "Get the federal contact to a different channel immediately," she said. "Not the compound line. Not anything that's been on that network. Use the Ferraro family's external attorney if you have to. Get the evidence package out of the compound systems and onto an air-gapped device tonight." A pause. "And find me who placed that device. That's the second source. That's who's been inside this building." She hung up. Dante was in the doorway of the storage unit. He had heard enough. His face was doing the controlled stillness thing again, but underneath it something was moving. "How bad?" he said. "Bad," Isabella said. "Get her to the car. We need to go." The drive back was 16 minutes. Isabella spent most of it with her phone off, thinking. She had been operating under the assumption that Marco's access to the organization's interior was limited to Luca Ferraro and possibly one other source. That assumption was wrong. The listening device in the study meant physical access to the compound, access that required either an existing relationship with someone on the household staff or a window of time during Aurelio's illness when security had been reduced. Elena Sara had been running the compound during those final months. Isabella did not want that to be the answer. Elena was 60-something and had run Aurelio's household for 15 years, and there was something in her manner, that compact efficiency, that undemonstrative care, that made it feel impossible. But impossible was not the same as not true. And the people most trusted were the people with the most access, and the most access was what someone would have needed. She did not say any of this in the car. When they got back to the compound, she went directly to the study. Rinaldi was there with a young man she didn't know, slight and precise-looking, who was working on the bookshelves with equipment she couldn't identify. The gap behind the second shelf was visible, a fist-width space in the wall where the plaster met an old heating conduit, invisible unless you were looking at exactly the right angle and exactly the right light. The device itself was on the table, small, black, the size of a thumbnail. Isabella looked at it for a long time. "Who has been in this room?" she asked. "Staff," Rinaldi said. "Cleaning, twice since your arrival. Elena supervises directly." He paused. "Dante, yourself, myself. The two Del Vanto men came through briefly on the day of the coalition meeting to review the documentation. Angelo Ferraro's assistant once when Angelo called and needed a private space to take a call. Angelo Ferraro's assistant. Briefly, perhaps 8 minutes. Isabella looked at the device. 8 minutes was enough. 8 minutes was more than enough for someone who knew what they were doing and had the device ready. What's his name? The assistant? Rinaldi thought for a moment. Paolo Sette. He's been with the Ferraro operation for... He stopped, something crossing his face. For approximately 2 years. 2 years, which put his arrival inside the window of Marco's systematic infiltration of the families. Isabella sat down in the chair at the table. The weight of the pregnancy was in her back, a persistent ache she had been managing all day, and she let herself feel it for a moment, just a moment, before she pushed it back. "We can't tell Angelo," she said. Rinaldi looked at her sharply. "If his assistant is Marco's operative, if we tell Angelo now, he'll confront Paolo directly. Paolo will run. Marco will know we identified him, and he'll cut whatever planned operation is in motion." She folded her hands on the table. "We need to know what Marco was using Paolo to do beyond the listening device. If there's an action planned, something using Paolo as an inside asset, we need to know what it is before we move. And if the action is imminent, then we're already out of time either way." She looked at Rinaldi. "Can you get me a full background on Paolo Sette?" "Everything. Where he came from before the Ferraro family, who vouched for him. Any financial anomalies?" "By morning. By midnight, if possible." He nodded and left. Dante was in the doorway again. He had a habit of appearing in doorways, she was learning, never quite entering, never quite leaving, staying at the threshold like a man who had not yet decided which side of a line he was on. "You're not going to tell Angelo," he said. "Not yet. He trusted you 3 days ago. He came into that coalition meeting because you told him the truth about his son." "I know. If he finds out you knew about his assistant and didn't tell him..." "I know, Dante." Her voice came out sharper than she intended. She breathed through it. "I know what it costs. I'm asking you to trust that I'm weighing it." Dante was quiet. Then, "What else did you find out tonight in that storage unit?" She looked at him. He was sharp. Sharper than she'd been giving him full credit for. He had heard the conversation with Rinaldi in the car, and he had heard enough to know she wasn't telling him everything. "The documentation Caravas gave me was a trap," she said. "The file was tracked. Marco has our network data. He knows where we've been communicating and with whom." Dante absorbed this without visible reaction, which was its own kind of remarkable. "So he has the study recording and the network map," Dante said. "Yes." "Which means he knows about the federal contact." "Yes." "And the coalition meeting logistics." "Yes." Dante came all the way into the room for the first time. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the dark lawn, the oak trees just barely visible in the ambient light. "He let you build it," Dante said. "He let you come in here, establish yourself, run the coalition meeting, develop the legal strategy. And he let you do it because he was watching every piece of it and learning how you think." "Yes," Isabella said, "which means everything we've done in the last week is compromised." "Not everything. The coalition meeting itself, the relationships, those aren't on a server. He can know we met. He can't undo that Angelo Ferraro and Petra Castellino were in the same room and made commitments." She kept her voice even. "The documentation Cara brought is still real. The financial records still exist. The tracker just means he knows I have them. It doesn't make them disappear." "The federal contact. Rinaldi is moving that right now." Dante turned from the window. "And Paolo Sette. We watch him. We give him nothing useful and we watch where he goes. And when Marco realizes we found the device..." Isabella looked at the small black thing on the table. "He probably already knows. These things usually have indicators." She kept her eyes on it. "He knows we found it, which means he knows we're going to change our operating pattern, which means whatever he has planned for Paolo Sette as an inside asset, he's going to move it forward, tonight, tomorrow, very soon." The room was very quiet. "He's going to do something to the families," Dante said. It wasn't a question. Yes, to the coalition. He needs to fracture it before it solidifies, before the federal process gets moving, before Karavos's testimony gets formalized. She pressed her palms flat on the table. He's going to create an incident that looks like it came from inside the organization. Something violent enough to make the families question each other, question me, question whether this coalition is a liability rather than an asset. When? I don't know. She looked up at him. I need you to make calls tonight. Not from this building, not from anything on the compound network. Use a phone that's never been on this property. Call Petra Castellino directly. Not through the Castellino staff directly. Tell her to increase security at her primary location tonight and tomorrow without explaining why. Call the Del Vanto men the same way. And Angelo Ferraro? A beat. I'll call Angelo myself, she said. She called Angelo from a phone Dante sourced from one of the compound's external security team, standing outside in the back garden in the cold, because the inside of the building no longer felt secure to her in the way it had 3 hours ago. Angelo picked up on the third ring, his voice alert in the way of a man who doesn't sleep deeply. Isabella, he said. It's late. I know. I need to tell you something. She told him about the listening device. She told him it had been placed by someone with access to the compound and that the most recent outside access had been his assistant. She told him she hadn't wanted to tell him tonight, that she had planned to gather more information first, but that she had decided he needed to know. She did not tell him what she was now almost certain of. She let him come to it himself. The silence on his end of the line lasted a long time. Paolo Set came to me, Angelo said finally, his voice very controlled, with a referral from a business contact in the Castellino family, a man named Vincenzo Ardente. Isabella was very still. Vincenzo Ardente was one of the 2 Del Vanto representatives who had attended the coalition meeting, not Castellino, Del Vanto. Angelo had said Castellino. Angelo, she said carefully, are you certain the referral came from the Castellino family? That's what Paolo told me when I hired him. A pause. 2 years ago. I had no reason to verify. Isabella looked at the oak trees. The wind was moving through them, the bare branches against the sky, and her mind was doing something very fast and very cold. Paolo Sette had come in with a fabricated referral, which meant he had not been placed by the Castellino family, which meant the coalition meeting had contained something she had not accounted for, a line of connection she had not traced to its end. She had been looking at Luca Ferraro and Paolo Sette as separate compromises, separate threads. But if Paolo's entry into the Ferraro family had been managed through a false Castellino referral, then someone had been coordinating those threads from outside both families. Someone who understood the organizational structure well enough to create a convincing paper trail across family lines. Someone who had been inside the organization for a very long time. She ended the call with Angelo and stood in the garden with the cold moving through her coat and her hand on her stomach, and her mind assembling a picture she did not want to be looking at. She went back inside. Rinaldi was in the entrance hall. He had a folder in his hands. The background on Paolo Set, he said. He held it out to her. She took it. She opened it. She read the first page, then the second, and then she stopped at the top of the third page where there was a single line, a reference in Paolo Sette's employment history to a prior position, 3 years before his arrival at the Ferraro family, working administrative logistics for a mid-sized import business in the western district of the city. The import business was one of the 3 shell companies in Karavos's financial documentation, one of the 3 vehicles Marco had been using to launder money. She looked up at Rinaldi, and then she understood something she had not understood before, something that reorganized every assumption she had been making, because Rinaldi's face was wrong. It was doing the careful, controlled thing it always did, but underneath it, for just a fraction of a second, something else had moved. The particular expression of a man who has been waiting for a door to open and has just seen it begin to. You knew, Isabella said. The words came out of her before she had finished thinking them, because her body understood it before her mind had fully assembled the proof, the way he had walked into her life at the shelter with such precision, the way he had guided her, step by careful step, through decisions that felt like her own. The way the listening device had been found, not by the security sweep he claimed to have done on arrival, but on his schedule, announced to her at a moment that was, now that she was looking at it, also the moment she was away from the compound. The way he had given her Caravas's number without explaining how it had come to him. "You knew about Paolo Sette," she said. "You knew, and you brought me the background file tonight because the situation has moved past the point where keeping me in the dark serves the plan." Rinaldi looked at her, and he did not deny it. "Sit down, Isabella," he said. "Tell me," she said. She did not sit down. "Tell me what you've been doing." The entrance hall was very quiet. Somewhere upstairs, one of the compound staff was moving. Outside, the wind was in the trees. Rinaldi set the folder on the side table by the door. He straightened his jacket in a small, precise gesture that she recognized, the one he made when he was preparing to say something he had been holding for a long time. "Your grandfather asked me," Rinaldi said, 3 months before he died, to make sure you came home. Not just to the compound, to everything. He believed that the only way the organization survived Marco Valenti was if you were fully committed. Not as an heir receiving an inheritance, but as a person who had no other option but to fight for it. He looked at her steadily. He knew you well enough to know that you would not commit fully if there was a door left open. He asked me to close the doors. The silence was absolute. "The shelter," Isabella said. Her voice was very quiet. "We were monitoring you from the moment you left Marco's apartment. We knew where you were. The timing of when you came to find me. Calibrated to give you enough time to understand what you'd lost before you were offered what you could gain." Caravas. "Genuine," Rinaldi said. "She is a real person and her documentation is real. But I knew about her before she contacted you. I had been in contact with her independently. When I gave you her number, I already knew she would call." He paused. "The tracker in the file that I did not know about. That was Marco's operation, not ours. That was a genuine compromise." Isabella stood very still. "The device in the study," she said. "Paolo Sette placed it. He is Marco's operative. That part is entirely true." He looked at her. "I brought you the background file tonight because the situation has changed. Because what I managed on Aurelio's behalf has run as far as it can run, and you need the full picture now to make decisions that are actually yours." She looked at him. This man she had trusted. This man who had stood at the foot of her bed in a shelter and told her the world was waiting for her. "Did my grandfather know about Dante?" she said. "Dante's doubt of you is genuine," Rinaldi said. "That was never managed." "And Angelo Ferraro's cooperation?" "Angelo's loyalty to your grandfather's memory is genuine. Everything at the coalition meeting was real." "But the path that brought me to that meeting," she said, "the specific choices I made that got me there, you shaped them." Rinaldi was quiet. "Yes," he said. Isabella looked at the floor. The tile was old, the same pattern it had been when she was a child, and she had a sudden unwanted memory of being 7 years old and sitting on this floor with her grandfather while he showed her something about the way the pattern repeated. Some lesson about structure, about how things that looked complex were built from simple elements that kept recurring. She had loved him. She had loved him, and he had spent the last months of his life arranging her return like a chess move, and she could not even be angry at a dead man. She looked up at Rinaldi. "I need you to tell me one thing," she said, "and I need it to be completely true, because everything I do from this moment forward depends on it." "Yes," he said. "Is there anything else you're managing that I don't know about?" He held her gaze. "No," he said. "You have everything now." She breathed in through her nose. The weight in her back was there, the persistent ache, and beneath it something else. A contraction, low and different from the others, gone almost before she could be certain it had happened. She filed it away. "Dante," she said. "I need Dante." "He's in the East Wing." "Get him." She picked up Rinaldi's folder from the side table. "And get me Paolo Sette's current location. I don't care how you find it." She looked at Rinaldi one more time, and what she felt was not forgiveness and not rage, but something precise and functional that she was going to need to be able to use. "And Salvatore, if you manage anything else without telling me, if you make one more decision about what I need to know and when I need to know it, we are finished." Do you understand that? Yes, Rinaldi said. Good, Isabella said, and she walked toward the study, and she had been sitting at the table for less than 4 minutes, the folder open in front of her and her mind working at the problem with everything she had, when Dante came in and looked at her face and said, "What happened?" And before she could answer, the first window on the south wall of the compound exploded inward in a cascade of glass, and the night outside went red. The window came in all at once, not a single break, but the entire frame, glass and leading, and the wooden sash, blown inward by something that had hit the exterior wall at velocity. The sound was enormous, and then immediately replaced by a second sound, lower and continuous, coming from somewhere outside on the south perimeter. Isabella was on her feet before the last piece of glass hit the floor. Dante was already moving, putting himself between her and the window, his arm out, and she felt the displaced air from the glass fragments even from 6 feet away, a cold rushing pressure against her face and hands. "Down," Dante said. "I'm not down." He grabbed her arm, not rough, but absolute, and pulled her toward the interior wall, away from the window line. She went because arguing would cost more than complying, and she was already thinking about what the sound outside meant. Not an explosion, too sustained for that, more like an accelerant catching, something burning at the perimeter. Rinaldi appeared in the study doorway. Behind him, farther down the hall, she could hear the compound staff moving, voices low and urgent. "South fence line," Rinaldi said. "2 vehicles. They set fire to the equipment shed." "Distraction," Dante said. "Yes," Isabella said, "because it was obvious when you thought about what Marco needed it to do." A fire at the perimeter pulled security outward. It created noise, light, movement. It created the kind of controlled chaos that masked a secondary action happening somewhere else on the property, or somewhere else entirely. "Where's Caravas?" Isabella said. "East wing guest room," Rinaldi said. "Get her out of the building. Use the kitchen exit, not the front." She was already moving toward the door. "And get me someone with a vehicle standing by at the north gate. Not compound staff. One of Dante's people." "Where are you going?" Dante said. "The study has the original network hardware. If Paolo Sette's next move is inside this building, the target is the evidence files, whatever Rinaldi hasn't already moved to the air gap device." She looked at Dante. "I need 5 minutes in there." "Isabella?" "5 minutes, Dante. Then I walk out with you." He looked at her with that expression she had come to recognize as the outer surface of something closer to fear than he would ever say out loud. He pulled a phone from his jacket and made a call in 12 words she didn't hear because she was already back in the study, at the desk, pulling the secondary drive from the lower drawer where Rinaldi had stored the transferred files 3 hours ago. The drive was a flat rectangular thing, matte black, no larger than a deck of cards. She pressed it into the interior pocket of her coat, against her ribs, and stood up. The second explosion was smaller than the first, but closer, somewhere between the main building and the detached garage. She felt it in her sternum more than heard it, a compression, physical, like a hand pressing against her chest from the inside. She breathed through it, stood still for exactly 2 seconds, then walked out of the study into the hall. Dante was there with one of his men, a compact person named Reyes who moved like someone who had been trained to occupy as little space as possible while remaining capable of significant force. Reyes was holding a phone to his ear and listening. "Second device was in the garage," Reyes said. "Incendiary. The vintage cars—" He stopped. "They're gone." Isabella thought of the 6 vehicles under canvas covers, her grandfather's collection, 40 years of it. She pressed her hand to her coat pocket, felt the edge of the drive through the fabric, and kept moving. "North gate," she said. They went through the kitchen, through the service entrance, out into the cold. The south side of the property was lit orange. She could smell the fire now, wood and accelerant and the synthetic bite of burning upholstery from the garage. The oak trees threw strange shadows across the north lawn, the fire's light reaching even here, making the familiar ground look wrong. A black SUV was idling at the north gate. One of Dante's external contacts, a man she'd never met, who looked at the 3 of them without surprise and unlocked the doors. Isabella got in the back. Dante got in beside her. Reyes took the front passenger seat. The driver pulled through the gate without being told. "Where?" the driver said. Isabella looked at Dante. Dante looked at her. Ferraro House, she said. Angelo needs to know tonight. Angelo Ferraro opened his own front door. He was dressed, which meant he hadn't slept. His face, when he saw the three of them on his front step, Isabella, Dante, Reyes still with the phone in his hand, did something complicated and then settled into the flat, prepared expression of a man who has spent his life receiving bad news and has learned to let it land cleanly. Come in, he said. They sat in the same front room as before. The reading lamp was still on. The glass of amber liquid had been replaced or refilled. Isabella told him everything. Not the version she had been planning to tell him, the managed version, the one that withheld Paolo Sette's name until she had more confirmation. All of it. The listening device, Paolo's employment history, the false referral, the fire at the compound tonight. She told him about Rinaldi and Aurelio's arrangement and what that meant for how she had come to be sitting in his front room in the first place. She told him because she had just spent the last 3 hours learning what happened when the people around her made decisions about what she was ready to know, and she was not going to do the same thing to Angelo Ferraro. When she finished, the room was quiet. Angelo sat with his hands folded on his knees and looked at the middle distance. Paolo Sette, he said. Yes. In my house for 2 years. Yes. My son was being manipulated by Marco. My assistant was Marco's direct operative. He said it the way you say something you're working to make real by saying it. My family has been a corridor for this man. Your family has been a target, Isabella said. That's different. Angelo looked at her sharply. Marco chose you specifically, she continued, because you were closest to Aurelio, because your cooperation or your conflict with the other families was the most significant variable in the organization's stability. He didn't compromise your family because it was easy. He did it because it was the most important piece. She leaned forward slightly, which also means that your alignment, genuine, informed, deliberate, is the most important piece of what we're building. A long silence. What do you need tonight? Angelo said. Paolo Sette's location, Isabella said. Whatever you know about his routines, his contacts, anywhere he goes that isn't your household. Angelo stood. He walked to the door and said something to someone outside it, a member of his household staff, waiting in the hall. A brief exchange, low voices. He came back and sat down. He has a room in Glenmore, 3 streets from here, Angelo said. He keeps it separately from the accommodations I provide. I only know about it because one of my security staff mentioned it in passing 8 months ago. I didn't think anything of it at the time. His jaw tightened. I should have. Can your man take us there? Angelo looked at her. The look lasted several seconds. If Paolo is there and he realizes what's happening, he'll run, or he'll do something else. I know, Isabella said. I'm not planning to approach him directly. Then what? I want to know if he's been contacted by Marco tonight. If Marco used the attack on the compound as a signal to move Paolo, to have him do something specific, make a call, transfer something, meet someone. I want to know what it was before Marco realizes we're looking. She looked at Angelo steadily. Paolo doesn't know we've identified him. He thinks the device is still active. That gives us a window. Angelo studied her. 30 minutes, he said. I'll have my man take you. After that, this becomes my matter to handle. Isabella did not argue with that. She understood what he meant, and she understood that it was his right. Paolo Sette's room was on the second floor of a narrow building sandwiched between a dry cleaner and a closed restaurant on Adler Street, 3 blocks from Angelo Ferraro's house. The building had a single external staircase on the east side, iron, original to the structure, with a landing at each floor. Reyes went up alone. He was gone 11 minutes. When he came back down, he handed Isabella a phone. Not his own, a different one, cheap, the kind you buy with cash, and said, 3rd drawer of the bedside table. He's not in the room. Isabella looked at the phone. The screen was cracked in the upper right corner and the case was peeling at the seam, the kind of phone that was supposed to be unremarkable. She powered it on. No lock screen. The recent calls showed 4 outgoing calls in the last 2 hours, all to the same number, and 1 incoming call that had lasted 6 minutes and 40 seconds. placed at almost exactly the time the south perimeter of the compound had gone up. She looked at the timestamp. The incoming call had come in 3 minutes before the fire started. Marco had called Paolo to trigger the operation. Paolo had been waiting for it. She scrolled to the messages. There was one, sent after the 6-minute call, to a number she didn't recognize. Done. Moving to secondary. She looked at Dante. He was reading her face. Secondary target, he said. Not the compound. She was already thinking. The compound was the distraction, the fire, the noise, pulling security outward. It was designed to move us out of the building, not to destroy the building. She looked at the message again. He needed us away from the compound for something to happen somewhere else. The evidence files, Dante said. You took the drive. But Rinaldi's federal contact, she said. We moved that communication off the compound network tonight, but we moved it to... She stopped. She had told Rinaldi to use the Ferraro family's external attorney as an intermediary channel if necessary. She had set it in the study, with the device still active behind the shelf. She called Rinaldi. 4 rings? 5. He picked up on the 6. The Ferraro attorney, she said. Whoever you used as an intermediary for the federal contact tonight, you need to warn them right now. A silence on Rinaldi's end that lasted precisely long enough to tell her she was right. I used Marta Engel, Rinaldi said, the Ferraro family's outside counsel. I called her from the compound landline 40 minutes ago. A pause. Before we found the device. Isabella closed her eyes, opened them. Call her, she said, right now. She kept the line open while Rinaldi made the other call. She could hear him on a secondary line, his voice muffled but urgent. She stood on Adler Street with the cold air coming off the lake and the orange glow still visible to the south where the compound's equipment shed was burning, and she waited. When Rinaldi came back on the line, his voice was different, stripped of its usual precision just for a moment before he controlled it again. Marta Engel's office was broken into tonight, he said. Her assistant is unharmed, but her filing system has been accessed. Physical files, not digital. And the attorney herself is not answering her personal phone. The federal contact's identity, Isabella said. Possibly. If Marta had made any written notation of our arrangement, find her, Isabella said, and get a message to the federal contact through a completely separate channel. Not anything connected to Marta Engel, not anything connected to the compound or the Ferraro family. If Marco has the contact's name, he'll move to neutralize them before they can open a formal inquiry. She paused. Go. She hung up. Dante was watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not doubt. Not the managed skepticism of the front steps 3 days ago. Something that was, underneath its surface tension, very close to concern. How much of this can you hold? He said. She looked at him. What? At once. How much of this can you actually hold? It was not what she expected him to say. She felt the ache in her back spike suddenly, sharper than before, spreading from the base of her spine in a way that made her breath catch, and she pressed her hand against the side of the car and held still. I'm fine, she said. You're not fine. His voice was quiet, not accusatory, just flat with accuracy. You've been running for 18 hours on 4 hours of sleep and you're 8 months pregnant, and someone just blew out a window 20 feet from where you were standing. He stepped closer. I'm not asking to stop you. I'm asking if you have enough left to finish this. She breathed through the ache. It receded, not fully, but enough. Yes, she said. Then tell me what we do. Jacin. What they did was drive to the waterfront. It was Reyes who found it, pulling addresses on Marco's property holdings from a database his contact maintained, cross-referencing against the coordinates in Paolo Sette's message history, eliminating properties by size and isolation until 2 remained. One was a warehouse in the northern district, too visible, too close to active commercial operations. The other was a decommissioned port facility on the Kellner waterfront, a cluster of loading buildings and storage structures that had been tied up in a development dispute for 6 years and sat legally frozen, neither operational nor demolished. Kellner Waterfront, the same street where Isabella had walked to the bus stop with wet shoes and $43, 7 weeks ago. She did not think about that for very long. They called Angelo from the car. Angelo made 3 calls of his own in rapid succession, and by the time the SUV reached the perimeter road of the waterfront facility, there were 2 additional vehicles behind them, men from the Ferraro household security operation, people Angelo had trusted for years rather than months. The facility was dark from the outside, a chain-link perimeter, portions of it sagging where the posts had rusted at the base. Inside the fence line, 3 large loading structures faced a central yard, and beyond them the dock extended over the black water, the lake visible beyond as a flat, dark absence. Isabella stood at the fence line and looked at the facility and felt, for the first time since the study window had come in, something clarify inside her. Not calm. She did not feel calm. But the specific quality of focus that comes when the problem has finally reduced itself to something with edges. Something you can see all the way around. Marco was in there. She was certain of it. Not certain the way you are when you have proof. Certain the way you are when you have spent 4 years learning how a person thinks, and you can feel the shape of their decision-making in the structure of what they've built tonight. The compound attack was too coordinated to be managed remotely. He was nearby. He was watching the outcome. She turned to Dante. "The loading structures," she said. "If he's inside, he'll be in the one with dock access, the southernmost building." She looked at Angelo's men. "I need the other 2 buildings covered. Not entered, covered. If anyone comes out of either of them, I want to know immediately." Angelo's security lead, a man named Torres, nodded without commentary. "Reyes," Dante said. Reyes was already moving toward the fence line. They went through a section of compromised fencing on the east side, single file, quiet on the broken asphalt. The air smelled like the lake, and old machinery, and beneath that the faint chemical residue of decades of industrial use. The central yard was open, exposed, and they moved along the edge of the northernmost building, staying in the shadow of its wall. Isabella kept pace with Dante. He glanced at her twice, and she looked back at him both times without slowing, and he stopped glancing. Her back was a consistent source of noise now. Not pain exactly, more like a persistent pressure that had stopped being ignorable. She breathed through it with the regularity of something she had been practicing. They reached the south building. The personnel door on its east face was not locked. It had been left open approximately 4 inches, which could mean carelessness or could mean someone on the other side was maintaining a listening gap. Dante put his hand on the door, looked at her. She nodded. He pushed it open and they went inside. The building's interior was a single large space, high-ceilinged, with structural columns at regular intervals and the dock doors at the far end that opened over the water. Emergency lighting, old, battery-backed, cast a low red-orange glow across the concrete floor. Shipping equipment had been left in place when the facility was decommissioned. Abandoned forklifts, stacked pallets, a row of metal shelving along the west wall holding nothing. And at the far end, near the dock doors, 3 people. 2 of them she didn't know. Marco's men, positioned at angles that told her they had been placed deliberately, that this arrangement had been considered in advance. The third was Marco Valenti himself. He was standing with his back partially to the dock doors, and the water was black behind him through the dirty high windows. And he looked at Isabella when she came through the personnel door with an expression she had not expected. Not surprise, not rage, relief, like a man who had been waiting for something to arrive and had begun to worry it wouldn't. "Isabella," he said. His voice was the same. She had braced for it, and it still landed in her chest with a physical weight, the particular timbre of it, the control. 4 years of that voice, 4 years of believing it meant something. "You engineered this," she said. Not a question. "All of it. The compound attack, the attorney's office. You were moving me here." "I was giving you options," Marco said. "You keep choosing the version where we end up in the same room. I've been trying to give you a different one." "You tried to take my daughter." Something moved in his face, quickly. "That was a legal instrument. It was designed to create negotiating leverage, not—" "It was designed to destroy me," Isabella said. Her voice was level. You thought that if you came after the baby, I would stop thinking about everything else. You thought it would break me back down to what I was when I left that apartment. She walked forward. Dante moved with her, slightly behind, and she heard him take a breath and hold it. It didn't work. Marco looked at her, really looked at her, the way he used to when she was 23 and didn't understand what the looking meant. You look like him, Marco said. Right now, you look exactly like Aurelio. I'll take that. It's not a compliment. His voice tightened for the first time. He was a man who wrapped everything he wanted in the language of what was best for other people. He made you feel like the choices were yours, and they never were. He stepped forward. I'm not the only one who's been managing you, Isabella. You know that now. Rinaldi told you tonight. I know he did, because I know Rinaldi, and I know when a man has held something past the point he can hold it. Rinaldi told me himself, she said. That's the difference. He chose to tell me, because the situation forced him to. Maybe. It doesn't change that he did. Marco stopped. He was 10 feet from her now. His men had not moved. Good positioning, patient, waiting for something that had not happened yet. She was aware of Reyes and Torres's people outside, covering the other buildings, and she was aware that this moment was balanced on something very precise and very fragile. Walk away, Marco said. It was not a demand. It was almost, not quite, but almost a request. Take the settlement. Take your daughter and leave this city. I will not come after you. I will not pursue the custody filing. I will leave you entirely alone. And the organization, it will be managed by you, by people who understand it. People who understand it, Isabella said, like the Luca Ferraros and the Paulo Setes you've been running inside it for 3 years? She watched something in his expression change. I have Caravas's documentation. I have the network records from the compound, which include communications you thought you were intercepting, but which we were managing after we found the device, which we found earlier than you believed we did. A partial truth precisely placed. I have the financial transfer logs for the shell companies, and I have a federal contact whose identity you do not have, because the copy of their information you obtained through Marta Engel's office was a document we prepared specifically for that possibility. That last part was a lie. She said it without hesitation. Something in Marco's face shifted. The first real shift, the first crack in the even surface. You're bluffing, he said. I've been in your world for 4 years, Isabella said. I know what a bluff looks like. What I just told you isn't one. The silence in the building was enormous. The lake moved beneath the dock doors with a quiet, rhythmic pressure. One of Marco's men shifted his weight slightly and then went still again. Marco looked at her, and Isabella watched, in real time, in the red-orange light of the emergency lamps. The thing she had been moving toward for 2 weeks happened in the space behind his eyes. The calculation running, the variables coming in wrong, the foundation of what he'd built, which had always depended on being the one in the room who knew the most, suddenly uncertain. There's nowhere this ends well for you, he said. His voice was still controlled, but it was working harder now to stay that way. I know, Isabella said. I've been thinking about that for 2 weeks. Then you know that I still have resources. You have people who work for you because you pay them, Isabella said. That's not the same as resources. The moment the federal inquiry opens, and it opens tomorrow morning, Marco, that's not a threat, that's a schedule. The people who work for you because you pay them are going to start making decisions about what their loyalty is actually worth. She kept her eyes on him. You've spent 3 years building something that belongs entirely to you, which means when it goes, it all goes at once. Marco's jaw tightened. You came here alone, he said, reaching now, looking for the lever. You're 8 months pregnant, and you walked into a building at night with 2 men, and you think... The dock doors behind him opened. Not dramatically. They rolled on their track, the way dock doors are designed to, and the noise they made was industrial and loud and cut Marco off mid-sentence. Through the gap, the dock was visible, and beyond the dock, the water. And on the water, lights. Federal watercraft. 2 of them, positioned on the lake side of the facility, their lights cutting across the dock surface in white and blue. And behind Isabella, the personnel door she had entered through opened again, and a voice she didn't know said, "Federal financial crimes. Everyone stay where you are." Marco turned back. His face had gone through several things in rapid succession and had landed on an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the controlled evenness, not the management, nothing she recognized from 4 years of reading him. He looked, for the first time in the time she had known him, like a man who understood that he had lost. His two men stepped back from their positions. Not running. They'd done the calculation, and the calculation had come out the same way Marco's had. The room had changed. The balance had changed. The thing Marco had spent 3 years building piece by careful piece was over. He looked at Isabella. "How long?" he said. His voice was very quiet. "The federal contact was established 6 days before Aurelio died," she said. "He started building this before I came home. He knew you were coming." Marco closed his eyes. Just for a second. Opened them. "Aurelio," he said, like a word he was tasting for the last time. The federal agents were moving through the space now, organized, purposeful. Torres's men outside were standing down. She could hear the quiet over the radio Reyes was holding. Dante was beside her, close enough that she could feel the tension leaving his body in increments, like a rope being slowly released. Her back sent a signal that was not ambiguous, a tightening that started low and moved upward, held for 15 seconds, and then receded. She breathed through it. Dante looked at her. "Isabella, I'm fine." "You keep saying that." "Because it keeps being true." She watched the federal agents reach Marco, watched him put his hands up with the measured compliance of someone doing a calculation, a final one, about what cooperation might preserve. "Get me to a car." "Right now," Dante said. She took one step and the tightening came back, stronger this time, unmistakable, and she stopped walking and put her hand against the nearest column and breathed and looked at the concrete floor of the dock building and understood that her daughter had been waiting with extraordinary patience and was now apparently done waiting. "Dante," she said, "I'm right here." "We need to go faster than I said." He had his arm around her before she finished the sentence, and they moved toward the door, and the last thing she saw before they went through it was Marco Valenti being guided toward the federal watercraft on the dock, his hands behind him, his back to everything he'd built, walking away from it in the direction the water pointed. The contractions were 4 minutes apart by the time the SUV reached Mercy General. Dante had his hand braced against the door handle the entire drive, not because of the road, but because Isabella had stopped pretending she was fine somewhere around the second traffic light and had gone quiet in the particular way that meant she was managing something internal with everything she had and could not spare anything for conversation. Reyes drove. He drove fast and he drove clean, no unnecessary movements, and Isabella focused on the back of his headrest and breathed the way she had taught herself to breathe in the last 8 weeks. Slow in through the nose, measured out through the mouth, treating the contraction like weather, something to move through rather than against. It did not always work. It worked better than nothing. The hospital entrance came up white and lit against the November dark, and before the car had fully stopped, a nurse with a wheelchair was at the door. Dante had called ahead, she realized, sometime in those last minutes at the dock building while she'd been watching Marco walk away. And Isabella did not argue about the wheelchair the way she might have an hour ago. She sat down in it and let herself be moved. Dante stood outside the emergency entrance with his hands in his pockets and watched the doors close behind her. She looked back at him through the glass. He raised one hand, a small gesture, something between acknowledgement and the specific helplessness of a person who has run as far as they can run beside someone and has now reached the edge of where they're allowed to go. She turned away and let the nurse take her inside. Victoria Montelus was born at 4:47 in the morning, 6 pounds, 11 ounces, a full head of dark hair. A cry that started small and then gathered itself into something surprisingly insistent for a person who had been in the world for less than 30 seconds. Isabella held her in the delivery room with the fluorescent lights too bright and her own hands shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the labor and everything to do with the specific, annihilating reality of another person existing where a moment ago there had been only the idea of one. She looked at Victoria's face, the compressed, ancient-looking face of a newborn, red and creased and entirely itself. and felt something move through her that she did not have a name for. Not joy exactly. Something larger and less comfortable than joy. Something that contained every version of the last 2 weeks and the last 4 years and the last 29 years, and pressed them all into this single unbelievable fact. The nurse asked if she wanted to make any calls. Later, Isabella said, and she did not look up from her daughter's face. She slept 3 hours in the hospital bed with Victoria in the bassinet beside her, one hand extended so that her fingertips rested against the side of the plastic bassinet, the contact unconscious, maintained even in sleep. When she woke, Dante was in the chair by the window. He had brought coffee, 2 cups, one on the table beside her bed, one in his hand, and he was looking out at the morning with the expression of a man who had also not slept, though his version had apparently involved a chair in a hospital corridor rather than a delivery room. "How long have you been here?" Isabella said. "A while. You should have gone back to the compound. The compound is being managed." He looked at the bassinet. "She's quiet." "She's been quiet for an hour. I think she's saving it." A silence. Not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that belongs to 2 people who have been through something together and have not yet figured out what to call each other on the other side of it. "The federal agents processed Marco at 4 this morning," Dante said. "Rinaldi has been in contact with their operations team. The financial documentation is in formal evidentiary custody. They're opening a full inquiry." He turned from the window. "Angelo's people located Marta Engel late last night. She'd been taken to a property in the North District. She's unharmed. She's already given a preliminary statement." "And Paolo Sette?" "Picked up at the Kellner facility perimeter. He was apparently still in the area when the federal watercraft arrived. He didn't run." Dante's mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Maybe he ran out of places to go." Isabella nodded. She reached for the coffee. It was lukewarm and slightly too strong, and she drank it without complaint. "Rinaldi," she said. Dante looked at her. "He's at the compound," Dante said carefully. "He hasn't asked about his position. He's been working through the night on the asset protection filings." A pause. "He looked like a man who expects to be dismissed and is completing his obligations before it happens." Isabella looked at the bassinet. Victoria's chest was rising and falling with the absolute unconcerned rhythm of the very new, the breathing of someone who has not yet learned to be afraid of anything. "He loved my grandfather," Isabella said. "He did what he did because Aurelio asked him to and because he believed it was what I needed." She picked up the coffee again. "That doesn't make it right, and it doesn't mean I trust him the way I trusted him before." She looked at Dante. "But it means I understand it. And in this world right now, understanding something is the most I can afford." Dante absorbed this. "So he stays." "He stays, with different terms." She looked at Dante. "You stay too, with the same terms you've always had. You tell me what you think, directly, even when it's wrong, and I do the same." Dante looked at her for a moment. "That's not how the organization has traditionally operated." "No," Isabella said. "It's not." He picked up his coffee, drank, set it down. "The Moretti branch sent a representative to the compound this morning, 3 hours after the news about Marco broke." His voice was carefully neutral. "He asked to schedule a meeting." "Of course he did," Isabella said. "What do you want to tell him?" "Tell him the meeting will happen when I'm ready for it, not before." She looked at the window. The morning light was coming in gray and flat, November light, the kind that doesn't commit to anything. "Give me a week." She was at the compound by the following afternoon. Elena Sara met her at the door with the same compact efficiency as the first day, took the bag, asked if Isabella needed anything. Isabella looked at her for a moment. This woman who had run her grandfather's household for 15 years, who had been in and out of the study during the days when the listening device was active, whose habits and patterns Paolo Sette would have observed and worked around. "Elena," Isabella said. "Yes." "Did you know about the device in the study?" Elena looked at her without blinking. "No," she said. "If I had known, I would have come to you." Isabella watched her face for the length of time it took to be reasonably certain. All right, she said. Elena nodded once, picked up the bag, and went inside. Isabella followed, and the smell of the compound came to meet her. Cedar and old wood and the faint mechanical residue that no amount of cleaning had ever entirely displaced. And she walked through it without stopping. She met with Rinaldi in the study on the second evening. He was standing when she came in, which was not his habit, and the fact that he was standing told her he had been in the room for some time and had not been able to make himself sit down. She sat. She gestured to the chair across from her. He sat. The room was quiet. The new window glass, the old one had been replaced while she was at the hospital, Elena's efficiency again, caught the evening light at a slightly different angle than the original, a small wrongness that she noticed and filed. Aurelio told you to bring me back, she said. Yes. He told you to manage the conditions of my return. Yes. And you did it because he asked you to, and because you believed he was right about what I needed. Yes, Rinaldi said. Both of those things are true. Were there other things? She kept her voice level. Beyond what you told me the other night. Anything else that was arranged? Rinaldi was quiet for a moment. The honest kind of quiet, not the strategic kind, She had learned, in 2 weeks, the difference between them. Your grandfather also asked me, Rinaldi said slowly, to make sure that if you came back and chose to leave again, if you decided the inheritance wasn't worth the cost, that you would have sufficient resources to do so comfortably. A separate account held outside the organization's structure. It would have been made available to you regardless of how the transition went. He looked at the table. He wanted you to have a real choice. He understood that a choice made under total constraint isn't a choice. Isabella looked at him. So the doors weren't as closed as you told me. The doors were closed in the ways that mattered, Rinaldi said. The financial path out was always there, but Aurelio believed, and I agreed with him, that you would not take it. Not because you couldn't, because you wouldn't. The room was very quiet. He knew me better than I knew myself, Isabella said. He spent 22 years watching you, Rinaldi said, and 4 years watching what happened when you left. Something in his voice shifted. Not breaking. Rinaldi was not a man who broke, but something at the edges of it, something that had been held for a long time. He talked about you every week, the whole time you were gone. He never stopped believing you would come back. He stopped. I'm sorry for the method. I'm not sorry for the result. Isabella looked at the surface of the table. She thought about the shelter on Dressler Avenue, the plastic chair and the fluorescent light, and the emergency contact field she'd left blank. She thought about $43 in her coat pocket and a garbage bag of clothes and the specific quality of that particular bottom, the kind you only find when everything that was propping you up has been removed and you discover whether there's anything underneath. There had been something underneath. She knew that now. She wasn't sure she would have found it without the fall. She was not sure she would thank anyone for the fall. The account, she said. The one Aurelio set aside. Yes. Use it to establish the foundation, she said. I've been thinking about the name, the Montelus Foundation. Programs for shelters, legal protection, financial assistance for people rebuilding after abuse. She looked at Rinaldi. Cora ran a shelter on Dressler Avenue. I want her involved in designing the program structure. She knows what people actually need when they're in that position. Rinaldi nodded slowly. And the organization's legitimate business holdings? We run them cleanly, Isabella said. Everything that can be restructured into legitimate operations gets restructured. The parts that can't, she paused. We'll have that conversation with the families, openly, in the room. No more arrangements outside the table. Some of the families will resist. I know. That's a conversation, not a veto. She looked at him. This is the part where I tell you what I need from you going forward. Are you ready? Yes, he said. I need you to be exactly what you are, Isabella said. Experienced, careful, connected. I need your knowledge of the organization and the families and the history that I don't have yet. What I don't need, what I will not have, is anyone making decisions about what I'm ready to know or when I'm ready to know it. She held his gaze. If you have a concern about something, you bring it to me and we discuss it. If you have information, you give it to me and let me decide what to do with it. Can you do that? Yes, Rinaldi said. And then, after a moment, he would be very proud of you. I know, Isabella said. She said it simply, without sentiment or performance, because it was simply true, and because acknowledging it was not weakness, and because her grandfather had earned the right to be acknowledged. I know he would. The coalition meeting happened on a Thursday, 10 days after the waterfront. All 5 families sent representatives. The Moretti branch sent the patriarch himself, a man in his 70s named Gio Moretti, who had not been in the same room with a Monteluce leadership figure in 9 years, who arrived 20 minutes early and sat at the table with his hands folded and waited without speaking. Isabella arrived last. She had Victoria with her, in a carrier against her chest, because there was no arrangement for the baby that felt right, and because she had decided, after 2 days of thinking about it, that she was not going to begin this phase of her leadership by hiding the most important thing in her life from the people she was asking to follow her. She sat down. The table was Aurelio's table, brought from the study for this meeting. It was large enough for 12, and there were 9 of them. The 5th seat on the Moretti side occupied by a younger man who was being groomed as the eventual successor, watching everything with careful eyes. Gio Moretti looked at Isabella. He looked at Victoria, asleep in the carrier, her small face tucked against Isabella's chest. He looked back at Isabella. 9 years ago, Gio Moretti said, without preamble, Aurelio and I had a disagreement about a piece of port territory. He believed I had acted outside the agreed boundaries. I believed I had not. We never resolved it formally. He kept his eyes on her. I want you to know that history exists. I'm not pretending it doesn't. I know it exists, Isabella said. I also know that Marco Valenti spent 2 years feeding that unresolved conflict to keep this organization divided. Whatever the original disagreement was, it became something he used. I'd like to know if we can separate the original matter from what it was turned into. Gio Moretti was quiet. That depends on whether the original matter can be addressed honestly. Then we address it honestly, Isabella said. Today, after the larger business is done. A pause. Gio Moretti unfolded his hands and laid them flat on the table, a small gesture that managed to communicate something like agreement and something like respect simultaneously. All right, he said. Isabella looked around the table, at Angelo Ferraro, whose face still carried the particular weight of a man who has discovered a long betrayal and is deciding what to build in its place. At Petra Castellino, who had brought her own attorney and had reviewed every piece of documentation before agreeing to attend, and whom Isabella had decided was the person in the room she most needed to earn rather than simply gain. At Gavino Del Vanto, the skeptic, who was watching her with slightly less skepticism than he had 3 weeks ago, which was something. At Dante, at the far end of the table, who caught her eye and gave her the smallest possible nod. Marco Valenti is in federal custody, Isabella said. The financial inquiry is open and moving. The documentation in federal hands is sufficient for a prosecution, and the individuals who are operating as his assets inside the organization have been identified and are no longer in positions to cause damage. She kept her voice even and direct. That's the past. I want to talk about what we build from here. She talked for 40 minutes. She talked about the legitimate business holdings and the restructuring plan. She talked about the foundation. She talked about the operating principles she intended to establish: transparency within the council, no arrangements made outside the table, decisions made collectively on matters that affected the collective. She talked about what she was asking from each family and what she was prepared to give in return. Nobody interrupted. That itself was something. When she finished, Petra Castellino spoke first. The restructuring plan for the Harwick operations, she said. The timeline is aggressive. It's achievable, Isabella said. If the Castellino family's logistics infrastructure is aligned with the Del Vanto shipping contacts the way your grandfather and Gavino's father originally designed it, before Marco created the conflict between you. Petra looked at Gavino. Gavino looked at Petra. Something passed between them. Old, complicated, the residue of a dispute that had never been entirely theirs to begin with. That's a separate conversation, Petra said. I know, Isabella said. I'll be in it. By the end of the meeting, nothing was resolved in the way that things get resolved when you sign documents and shake hands and call something done. What had happened was something less clean and more real. The beginning of a willingness. The first hesitant architecture of something that might, given enough time and enough work and enough days where nobody did anything that destroyed it, become the thing her grandfather had spent 30 years building. It was enough. It was, for now, what she had. She found Kara Voss 2 weeks later, living in a sublet in Andersonville with a box of clothes and a laptop and the specific quality of a person who has stopped expecting the next thing to be good. Isabella drove herself. She had been driving herself to more places, a small, deliberate reclamation of ordinary motion, the kind that didn't require a driver or a security detail, and that reminded her what it felt like to be a person moving through a city rather than a position being protected. Kara opened the door and looked at her, and the expression on her face moved through several things quickly before settling. "You don't have to do this," Kara said. "I know," Isabella said. "Can I come in?" The apartment was small. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee that was better than the hospital coffee had been, and Isabella told Kara about the Montelus Foundation, the structure, the purpose, the program design she was developing with Cora from the Dressler Avenue shelter. "I want you to run the financial oversight," Isabella said. "The foundation's accounts, grant disbursement, program budgeting. You spent 3 years inside Marco's operation learning exactly how money gets misused. I want someone at the foundation who understands that from the inside and won't let it happen on our end." Kara wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. She looked at the table. "You know what I did," Kara said. "I worked for him for 3 years knowing what he was. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment to leave, but the truth is, I was afraid and I stayed longer than I should have." "I know," Isabella said. "I did the same thing." Kara looked up. 4 years, Isabella said. "I'm not offering you this because your record is clean. I'm offering it because you made a decision to do something difficult when it mattered, and that's actually the qualification that counts." She looked at Kara steadily. "Take a week to think about it." Kara looked back at her coffee. "I don't need a week," she said. The formal sentencing happened on a gray Tuesday in January, 4 months after the waterfront. Marco Valenti received 42 years on federal charges of money laundering, organized financial fraud, witness tampering, and conspiracy. His attorneys had spent 3 months building arguments that collapsed one by one against the weight of documentation that had been assembled across 18 months of quiet federal groundwork that Aurelio Montelucci had initiated, Isabella had completed, and Kara Voss's testimony had made airtight. Isabella was not in the courtroom. She had considered it. She had decided that the closing of something did not require her to witness the door shut. She was at the compound when Dante called with the verdict. She was in the East Garden, which had been neglected through the fall, and which she had been slowly, impractically, restoring herself. Not with a gardener, but with her own hands, on the days when Victoria was sleeping, and the compound was quiet, and she needed to do something physical and uncomplicated. She was wearing work gloves, and there was dirt on her knees, and her phone was in her coat pocket. She listened to Dante tell her the number. She said thank you. She hung up. She knelt down and pulled a root from the frozen ground and tossed it into the wheelbarrow beside her. She stayed in the garden another hour. She met with Gio Moretti privately, as she had promised, on a February afternoon in the study. They sat on opposite sides of the table and went through the 9-year-old port dispute with the actual documentation, not the received version that had calcified in the telling, and within 40 minutes they had identified the specific misunderstanding at its origin. A handshake agreement between 2 men who had each understood it differently and neither of whom had written it down, and the 2 years of manufactured conflict that Marco had layered over it. When they finished, Gio Moretti sat for a moment with his hands on the table. "Aurelio was a man I respected and competed with, and occasionally despised," he said. "I assume you want to know if I can work with you differently." "I want to know if you want to," Isabella said. Gio looked at her, something in his face that was not warm exactly, but was genuine in the way that only things that cost something can be genuine. "Yes," he said, "I want to." "Then that's where we start," she said. The foundation held its first formal gala in March. It was not a gala in the traditional sense. Isabella had vetoed the word and the format and replaced it with a working dinner at the compound. 30 people, shelter directors and legal advocates and program coordinators, sitting at the long table with actual food and actual conversation about what the work looked like on the ground. Cora from the Dressler Avenue shelter sat to Isabella's left. She was wearing the same kind of clothes she wore at the shelter, practical and unadorned, and she spent the dinner asking pointed questions about resource allocation that made two of the financial advisors at the table visibly uncomfortable, which Isabella found extremely satisfying. Dante sat at the far end of the table and ate and listened and occasionally said something precise and useful and then went back to listening. He had developed, over 3 months of daily proximity, a particular kind of quiet that was nothing like the silence of a man withholding judgment. It was the quiet of a man who had made one. Rinaldi was not at the table. He had declined when Isabella invited him, saying he thought this particular gathering was not his to attend, and she had understood what he meant, that some distances, once established, are better maintained carefully than crossed too quickly. He was still at the compound. They worked together every day. The terms they had set in February held. After the dinner, after the guests had left and the kitchen staff had cleared and the compound had settled into its night sounds, Isabella went upstairs and checked on Victoria, who was asleep in the room that had been prepared for her before Isabella arrived. Another thing Rinaldi had arranged. Another thing she had chosen to understand rather than relitigate. She stood in the doorway for a while. Victoria was on her back, arms out in the particular surrender of infant sleep. The dark hair already less dark, already becoming its own specific color that wasn't Isabella's and wasn't anyone else's, just its own. Isabella thought about a plastic chair on Dressler Avenue, about a form with an empty emergency contact field, about standing outside a building in the rain with $43 and a garbage bag and the specific weight of having nothing left to lose, which she had not understood at the time was also the weight of having nothing left to protect except the one thing that could not be taken. She thought about her grandfather, who had loved her in a language she had not always known how to speak, and who had spent his last months building a path back to him that she could only walk after he was gone. She thought about Marco, which she did less often now, and differently, not with anger, which had been too expensive to maintain, but with something that was simply the fact of him, the 4 years, the specific education of learning that something you believed was one thing was actually another, and surviving the lesson. She pushed off the door frame and went down the hall to the study. She sat down at the table, her grandfather's table. The same wood, the same weight, the same surface that had held 40 years of his decisions and now held hers. She opened the Foundation's program document, the one she had been building with Cora and Kara and the legal team, the actual working document, 28 pages of practical detail about how money moved from assets to people who needed it. She read through the current draft, made notes in the margins, crossed out a paragraph that said something true but said it uselessly, and rewrote it in 3 cleaner sentences. Outside, the oak trees moved in the lake wind. The sound of them was the sound of this house, the specific acoustic signature of this place, and she had learned to stop noticing it the way you stop noticing the sound of your own breathing. It was simply the sound of where she was, which was the only place she had ever actually been going. She kept working. The lamp on the desk made a small circle of light in the large room, and outside the circle the room was dark, and beyond the room the compound was quiet, and beyond the compound the city ran its long nighttime current. All those lives moving through the dark, all those people in the places they'd arrived at through the specific series of choices and accidents and losses and survivals that had brought them there. She was one of them. She had always been one of them. The Monteluse name, her grandfather had once told her, was not an inheritance, it was a responsibility. She had not understood that when he said it. She understood it now, not because she had been told and finally listened, but because she had gone all the way to the bottom of what she was and come back carrying something real. She turned the page and kept reading, and the oak trees moved in the dark outside, and her daughter slept down the hall, and the work continued.